Hi, and welcome to the KindHuman Cycling Show. I am your host, Gavin, and today we are joined by Elise Yanover. Elise is a physiotherapist who works in Toronto. Her office is actually quite near to our shop at KindHuman, and I've known Elise for many, many years. She taught swimming where I went to camp as a kid. And then I broke my arm a few years ago, and Elise is who I saw to help with my rehab. And by following her instructions I found that I was able to deal with the pain, return to good health very quickly, and most importantly, get on the bike as quickly as I could. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Elise. And Elise, my first question for you is, why is flexibility and strength training so important for us as cyclists and people listening today? Where I wanted to start was, why are we here today, and how is talking to you going to help our customers?
So when a lot of people get interested and serious about a sport, whether recreationally or competitively, they tend to focus just on the sport itself. And I originally came from a running and triathlon background, and it's one interesting community in that we just run or we ride or we do, our sport, but we don't take the time to do the things around it that we need to do in order to stay healthy, stay injury free, or prevent injuries. So it's both preventative and it can be a management technique if you have something that's going on. And it's such an important facet of sport, and improvement in sport is being strong around that. And if we think about our Olympians or our elites, right, they just don't do their sport. If you follow any of them on social media, they spend a lot of time stretching, foam rolling, doing core, and that's to help them not only manage injuries and their level of training, but also make them a stronger athlete. So that's what we're here to hopefully get people to do.
Well, thank you. That's a really great start. And so I think where we're going to start today is on flexibility. So as a cyclist, why is flexibility important?
Well, if you think about the position that you're cycling in, number one, and not only just cycling, but our jobs require so much forward bending. So upper back is a big complaint with people that cycle a lot. And it's not just their cycling, but it's also their everyday lives and our posture. So the position we're bent over, our hips are in a flexed position, and that's another very common injury area or tight area for people that we want to work on. So it's the position and the repetitive motion of the cycling. We're clipped in, we're not varying what we're doing in our position the same way we are if we're in a free environment. So being in those positions for a long time or very often can cause a lot of tightness in those areas. So we kind of want to work on that.
And one of the things you've said to me when we've been working together is that if I'm feeling pain in my lower back, for example, or another area of my body, the pain's actually being caused by another location. Can you talk a bit about that?
So it can be caused by another location or another instant. Like a lot of people's first line of defense, and as a physio, the people that I see, I'll give them a set of exercises to do for whatever body part. Let's use a lower back, for example. And everybody's first line of defense is to stretch, right? Stretch, 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 stretch. And so you come in, you say, have you done your exercise? Yeah, well, I've done my stretching, because stretching is the easier thing to do than strengthening. But a lot of injuries and a lot of issues come from a balance between muscle strength and flexibility. And so if we just are stretching all the time, we're actually making our muscles really long. And if you think of I'm sort of going off on tangents a little bit, but things are coming to my head. If you think about trying to contract your bicep from this position, okay, or contracting it from this position, okay, it's much harder to do it from a lengthened position. So if we're always constantly lengthening our muscles, it's harder to get the fibers to contract. So doing too much stretching can actually make you weaker, and then it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. So we want to balance both strength and flexibility. And sometimes it's a matter of going to see somebody or being able to assess for yourself whether your issue is more of a strength issue or a flexibility issue. Back pain, for example, in terms of coming from somewhere else, particularly with the hip flexors for cyclists, those attach up into the pelvis area, which changes the position of our lower back. So if we're really tight in our hip flexors, our pelvis is going to be tipped forward, and we're going to be putting more stress on our lower back. So that's just one example of a muscle that can cause pain somewhere else. Hamstrings is another one. Again, it's because of where it attaches, it affects the position of our back, and that can cause the pain, even though the pain is in our back.
Okay.
So if we're just addressing the area of the pain, we're not actually necessarily fixing the cause.
That's really good.
Off a little bit, but I had things just come to me.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So what you're saying is I might be feeling pain in my lower back, but just stretching my lower back is not necessarily going to help. I got to
right.
rest.
Or if you're going for treatment, you're going for massage, you're going to physio. If they're just working on your back, they're not looking at some of those other things where it can be coming from. And sometimes that takes more than one time of going to see a professional or working on a specific area, but it's catching that, oh, that's not really working. Okay, where else do we need to look? Or do we need to look at your bike position? That's another huge one for injuries. Like example, I just got my new bike, and I am very sensitive to a seat height. And I know as soon as my outside of my quad, where my quad, my muscle here, where the IT band comes in, if my seat's a little bit off after I ride, I'll feel that. And so I knew right away, lower it those couple millimeters, went out for a ride, and it's fine. So it's really, there's so many other facets of it. But, we look at, if we've been fit well, we look at some of the other issues before, and then we can play with all of those different areas. And it's also, again, there's so many different facets. There's training errors, which, can get into another time. But there's lots of issues around injury, and that's why it's good to kind of take a look at all those parts. What are you doing? What are you not doing? And hone in on what you need to do.
Okay, so that's really helpful as a bit of an overview perspective. Now, what are things that cyclists can do from, like, is it flexibility, strength, both? What are the routines that we should be building into?
Definitely both. So I'm going to go through the main areas to stretch. There's about 6 or 7 muscles that I would stretch. And people ask, when should I do this? Some people, the thinking always is, well, should I stretch before? And no, you don't need to stretch before. You need to do a dynamic warm-up. So when you get on your bike, whether you're inside or you're outside, you don't want to hammer it out from the gate. Okay, you want to do a nice light pedal, get your body warmed up, and everybody's time to warm up is different. Okay, older people takes longer, younger people takes less time, tighter, whatever. You got to kind of find out what works for you. Stretching after is far more important than stretching before, because you've actually contracted those muscles. So you're doing repetitive, activity with those muscles. They're working all the time. If you get off your bike and you don't stretch, those muscles are sitting in a shortened position. Okay, so they're tightened, if you want to call it, or they've been used. Then you go to, let's say, bend over and get your, dog, and you pull your back. Why have you pulled your back? Because you've ridden for 1 or 2 or 3 hours, and those muscles are tight, and then you try to go extend beyond what is their normal mobility, and you cause something else.
So So you talked about stretching after you finished a ride. If somebody doesn't have time, or just for whatever reason isn't going to stretch after they're riding, does stretching on a regular basis help prevent that? Or does it have to be after the ride?
I think definitely maintaining a level of flexibility is important, but it's those times where you go to do something else that requires that flexibility. And again, this will all depend on how long you've ridden and how hard you've ridden. So, if you've gone for an easy spin for an hour, 45 minutes, if you can't get to stretching right after, it's probably not crucial. If you've been out doing 100K, in the hills, and you're pushing and you come home, it's often when you have those issues that come up the next day, the day after. So try to at least get to it at some point during that day. And a lot of times what I say is, when I come home from a ride, or I've come off my trainer, I will spend maybe 5 minutes at the most stretching out those main muscle groups, and then I'm on my way. I'm not doing a half an hour session. So,
So,
you know, what I'm doing while I'm doing it, I'm loading Strava, I'm commenting on people. Like, we all have those extra 5 minutes, you know, usually when we get home. And if we don't, sometimes it's, sometimes it's, you know, it's just what we make our priority for.
so then, how frequently are you stretching, or how frequently do you advise people to stretch on a weekly basis?
So I recommend, usually, like I said, stretching after activity. So if you ride 3 days a week, try and get those few minutes of stretching in after your ride. And if you don't have that time, you know, probably minimum 3 to 4 days a week to stretch out those major muscle groups so that you can prevent injuries from happening.
So then, can you walk us through some of the stretches that we should be doing?
Yeah. Okay. So for the front of our thighs, which is what we use mostly when we ride, you want to do what's called the quadricep. Okay, so I'm gonna, if you need a little bit of something for balance, you're gonna grab onto your ankle or your foot. If you don't have that kind of flexibility, you can take a strap and put it, or a towel, or, you know, your whatever you've brought home from cycling if you have handy, and you can grab onto that and help the range of motion. Okay, so grabbing onto my foot, the important thing with this stretch is to keep your thigh back. So some people will stretch with it up here or out here, or use the opposite hand. Use same hand and just hold on to the thigh like that. And in terms of time limit for stretching, I usually recommend about 20 to 30 seconds. That's what's shown to actually lengthen tissue. If you go for 5 seconds in terms of the whole research of stretching, that doesn't give it enough time to lengthen the fibers. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is for hamstrings, so back of the thigh. Most people have really tight hamstrings, especially if you sit a lot for your job. So it's a good idea to have a low surface, a stair, or, you know, you can even just sort of bend over and do it if you want to, but something low. And when you're doing hamstrings, so stretching the back of your thigh, you want to bend from your hips. A lot of people will do this to compensate for lack of hamstring flexibility. If you feel the stretch here, don't go any further. This is your stretch. You don't have to, you know, try out for the National Ballet. You just have to be able to get a little bit of a pull. And so this would be your hamstring stretch, just stretching from the hips. And in terms of, so coming on to that point, in terms of how intense to do stretch, just stretch to the point of tension, to the point of feeling it. If you stretch beyond that, your muscles actually have, they're called Golgi tendon organs, these organs that prevent us from overstretching. So if we do overstretch, we're firing those things and they're not able to control how much we're stretching. So onset of stretch is the perfect place to stop and hold it at that position. Okay?
Okay.
So that's hamstrings. The next one is for your calf. So how I like to stretch my calf, some people like to do it standing on a stair and just letting their foot drop back. The problem with that is that you can't really control how much weight is going down, and sometimes people will injure either calf or the tendon, the Achilles tendon at the back of the calf. So what I like to do is, you know, I'm standing against a wall, use this as my wall, and just put my foot up onto the wall and then lean into the wall. Okay, so that gets my calf really well. The other way you can do it, as most people will do a calf stretch, is to go against the wall, and can you see that there? And just push down the heel. And again, depending on how flexible your calf is, you might need to move it in, or, you know, you could take it back till you feel it. In terms of the calf too, there's two parts to your calf. You know, the gastroc, which is the big one people have heard about. And then there's one called soleus, which is actually one of a very common ones that people can tear, not so much cycling, but explosive things. Or, you know, the client that did it, she was dancing and she tore it because she had done a bunch of stuff that had tightened her calf. So for soleus, you just want to bend your knee a little bit because that muscle does not cross over the knee. So we have to kind of knock out the bigger, the longer one and get the shorter one. That's how we do the soleus. Okay. And oftentimes people skip calf stretching for cycling, but you know, that heel down motion come around, you use a ton of calf. So it's really, really important to stretch your soleus and your calf muscles when you're stretching. Hip flexors. So this is a really important one, as we spoke about, because we're sitting in that position. We're using our hip flexors a ton when we ride. Okay, since for this one, probably the easiest way to do it is in standing. And with this one, so it's sort of a lunge position, but what a lot of people will do is they'll go really far into a lunge, and then you're not really getting the stretch on the hip. I'm stretching my right one here. What you want to try to do is just tilt your pelvis under a little bit. Can you see that, Gavin?
I can, yes.
Okay, so I'm just almost like I tell people, like, shove your thigh forward, tilt your bum under a little bit, and you should feel it up at the top part of your hip if that's kind of your tightest part. Some people feel it a bit lower down because it's getting a bit of quad too, but doing it up there. What I'm doing with my calf, can you see the back of my foot? Is I have it up. Can you see that or not?
Yeah, a little bit. If you take a step back.
Back, like this way?
Towards your bike. Towards the mat, yeah. Perfect.
There. Okay, so I have it up because people tend to have really tight calves. If you keep it down and you do this, people go, oh, I feel it in my calf. So if I have my foot up, it takes my calf out of it. Okay, the other way you can do it, and again, I do it like this because I'm outside when I don't even walk in the house before I stretch if I'm on an outdoor ride, and I don't walk upstairs if I'm on an indoor ride, because then I won't do it. So I do it before I even walk in the house, before anyone's getting at me, or I need to do other things. So if you're going to be inside and doing it, or doing it later, you can do it from your knee. So it's the same position. I'm shoving my thigh forward, like tilting my pelvis under, but then it totally takes my calf out of it. So I don't have to worry about, my calf getting into it and feeling the stretch there. So those are two different ways to do it.
Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. That's
cool.
Super helpful.
Okay. Now, so iliotibial band, which most people think about from a running perspective, gets tight, but it's a band of tissue. It's not even a muscle, but it runs from the top of your hip and it attaches down at the bottom part of your knee. And again, talking about seat position, this one is really important for getting that proper fit. And so what the band does is a bunch of muscles attach into it, but when it gets most irritated and most tight is when your knee passes through a 30-degree angle. So if your fit is such that you are kind of right at that 30, that might be where you have the problem. So usually a seat that's too high is going to cause tightness to happen, and it happens kind of outside part of the knee right here. So usually lowering the seat a little bit can adjust that, but in terms of stretching it, probably the best way for me to do it is in side front view. So if I'm going to stretch my left one, okay, I'm going to take my right leg over my left leg. I have a little bit of a bend in my right knee, and then I'm basically shoving my hip out to the side. Okay, so I'm getting a stretch down the top part, so the outside part of my knee and the outside part of my hip. Okay? And so that's going to get that band all the way down. And again, it's sort of path of least resistance. The tightest place that you are in is where you're going to feel it the most.
Okay, yeah, that's
very important. Sometimes people can't really feel this one in a stretch, so I'll often recommend like the torturous foam roller, which we'll demonstrate after, because the foam roller gets it really well. But it's worth even just like, again, when I get off my bike, I just do one on each side and I call it a day. And if I don't do it, I know later. Like everybody's sensitivity to stretching is different, but I see a lot of people in my clinic who are 40 plus and they've never stretched before, and it's starting to catch up. So there you go. The next one is for a muscle on the side part of the hip. It's called gluteus medius. And again, if you're going to do it outside, you've just come in from a ride, putting one foot over another and sitting down on it. Okay, if you've got a, I have my backyard, I've got my windowsill, or you can hold on to something for support if you need. But that's the way of getting the muscle on the outside part of the hip that we use for our pelvis position. So we use it a ton with cycling. And when this one gets tight, like you're talking about other things that can get affected, knee pain, lower back pain, IT band, all of those things can come from that muscle being tight. Okay, I'll
Gotcha.
demonstrate one if you're going to do it from home. Can you see me here on my back?
I can, yeah.
Okay. Crossing one foot over another, putting your knees into your chest. If you're flexible enough, if you feel it enough just here, pushing your leg out to the side, and that's going to get that muscle there.
And can you just point to where you're feeling it in that
the
stretch?
muscle?
Yeah.
So I'm going to feel it. I'm going to feel it on this muscle right here at the side.
Okay.
So this muscle is, so with people with knee problems primarily, every time you take a step or every time you put pressure down on something, it's this muscle that keeps my pelvis level. So if this muscle is weak, I'm going to drop down. And so it's really important not only to be strong in this muscle, which we do anytime we do sort of balance activities, squats, lunges, things like that, but also flexible so that it allows the freedom of movement in our hips and things like that. It can be a big issue with other injuries. And finally, lower back. So with cycling, your lower back gets tight, but at the same time, I think that core stability, which we're going to get to, is probably way more important. And the reason our back is getting tight is because our core is not strong enough to hold us in that like half position. And so I know for myself, being inside versus being outside are two totally different uses of the lower back. As soon as I get outside and I hit hills and I go longer, I start to get this like backache, and I have to, be on my bike and stretch it, and like get home and I can barely move, and I have to start firing my core, firing my lower back more to be able to hold that position. And then, into June or whatever, I feel better. But that's if you've been riding inside and you go outside, it's a totally different beast of using your back. So in terms of stretching for your back, one you can do is just like a sort of child's pose like this, where I'm just reaching forward and I'm getting a good stretch of my arms too. And then to get the muscles on either side, you just curl your hands to the right. Okay, I'm gonna get a good stretch along this muscle here, this big long one, which this muscle here will do a lot of work when our core isn't working. Okay, the muscle is called QL. A lot of people who have been for treatment for their back have heard of QL, or quadratus lumborum. That's a muscle that actually is there to move us. It's not there to stabilize us. But when we don't have a strong core, it does all the stabilization, and it becomes like you go for massage, you're like, oh, that kills. That's doing all the stabilization work for you. Okay? So that's how I would stretch my lower back. And then if I was going to do the left side, I would just crawl my hands over to the left, and I'll get a good stretch along this side here. Okay? But if I don't have a strong core, right, that stretching I'm doing is I'm just going to go back like that because I have nothing that's like keeping it stable. I have nothing that's actually keeping it loose. It's working hard to stabilize me.
Okay.
Make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Okay, I'm like.